Alright, so when the Scissors of Parvos update drops, what's going to be very interesting are some of the weapons that may or may not receive a huge damage bonus as part of the brand new mods, i.e. the Galvanized mods. So let's have a look at some of the weapons that I'm going to be very interested in keeping an eye on when the update hits. Number 5. For number 5, it's going to be the Scourge. It's a pure status, pure elemental weapon, so the big thing will be how powerful it becomes with the Galvanized Aptitude mod. The Scourge is already a very powerful primer for things like Ignition Overload, and this is mainly because it can proc both corrosive and viral status effects as well. You could also chuck in heat if you really feel like it, or radiation if you really feel like it. Against corpus enemies and shielded enemies, you could potentially swap it to do something like magnetic gas if you so desire. Stands to reason, therefore, that if a weapon like the Scourge is a really good way of priming Condition Overload, it itself should be able to prime the Galvanized Aptitude secondary effect pretty damn easily, especially since they are effectively the same secondary effect. Unfortunately though, the Scourge can only maintain 3 status effects at any given point in time, since that's basically all it has. It has no IPS, so it's pure elemental. You could potentially therefore use a melee weapon such as a Glaive, or a Zorus, or hell even Nincondi/Prime to further produce even more status effects on those enemies. The big question, of course, if you want to do that, is whether or not Galvanized Aptitude will have a cap, in much the same way that Condition Overload is going to have a cap of 3 status effects. Any more will be completely meaningless, but any less will of course result in less damage. So if Galvanized Aptitude is also going to have that cap, then at that point, it seems like the Scourge should be perfectly fine by itself to be absolutely 100% self-sufficient. So we'll just have to see if that happens to be the case. Galvanized Aptitude and Galvanized Chamber are probably going to be really powerful on something like the Scourge, but they do require kills in order to maintain their value. With something like the Scourge, I would expect that you'll have to rely quite heavily on trash mobs, because it's definitely not a weapon that can easily dispatch heavy enemies very quickly, although once you get a lot of those status procs going, you might be able to even dispatch heavy enemies within a relatively nice pace. Number 4. For number 4, we're going to be looking at 4 weapons simultaneously. They're going to be the Bubonico, the Ballistica and Euphona Primes, and the Epitaph. And the reason why I want to look at these weapons in particular is because they're all going to be in an interesting spot where you have one firing mode that would massively help the other firing mode do an extra ton of damage with the new Galvanized mods. So what do I mean by that? The Bubonico's burst fire coats enemies with modern elementals and viral procs. The Ballistica Prime's normal firing mode can quickly proc modern elementals and IPS. The Euphona Prime's alt fire is a shotgun type attack which will basically also proc modern elementals and IPS, whilst the Epitaph's uncharged attack lobs grenades that not only proc modern elementals, it will also do blast, cold and IPS procs. So you can see a pattern here. All of these weapons have a firing mode that can prime enemies with enough status effects so that the other firing mode, which happens to be a high crit firing mode by the way, ends up doing a ton of extra damage. For example, the Bubonico's normal firing mode is a high crit rate, high fire rate mode, so it also seems to shred like crazy. You could potentially then pair this up with something like Galvanized Savvy to do even more damage, especially in a higher level. The Ballistica Prime's charge shot would basically be a bow that does even more damage because you have enemies that are already primed with the amount of status procs that the Ballistica Prime's regular firing mode would give them. And if that's the case and it does enough damage, you could potentially start making a small ghost army as well as part of the gimmick for Ballistica Prime. The Euphona Prime's normal slug is basically a really high crit single shot, so pretty much pairing that with something like a Condition Overload situation through the use of something like Galvanized Shot, you're pretty much going to be doing a lot of damage per hit. And Epitaph's charge shot is effectively a railgun, which seems to guarantee impact procs as well, which is also pretty hilarious, so we'll have a look at that a little bit later, but essentially the idea is that it's going to be doing a lot of damage on a single target, potentially other targets as well, if you happen to have enough punch through in that weapon, which I believe it already comes with innately, so that's going to make it even stronger. For the Bubonico, I'll probably just stick to using Galvanized Hell and Galvanized Savvy, but for Euphona Prime, Ballistica Prime, hell even the Epitaph, I'll probably try and fit all 3 of the Galvanized mods into their builds to see what kind of nonsense we can get up to with these weapons. Number 3. For For number 3, it's going to be the Astilla and Axolotl Primes, and the reason why I want to look at these weapons as well is because they're going to be high impact based status weapons. Now, as demonstrated by Pablo in the dev workshop, the Astilla Prime is probably going to be one of the most anti-heavy weapons in the game. We're looking of course at an impact based shotgun that is very capable of applying 10 stacks of impact status effects to enemies such as corrupted heavy gunners and bombards, or things like nullifiers as well. This effectively brings their health threshold to around about the 80% mark when they can start to get paras on, and when you get paras on you pretty much die instantly, so that would make this kind of weapon extremely strong at taking out really heavy enemies. The same can be said for the Axolotl Prime as well, because the Axolotl Prime is an impact based fast firing weapon with a really high status chance. If anything, you could make the argument that the Axolotl Prime would be the absolute bane of nullifiers, being a fast firing weapon that is impact based that can then produce the amount of damage and impact procs that would cause something like a nullifier to actually be parasoned at the 80% mark. Galvanized Hell, Galvanized Diffusion, as well as Galvanized Savvy and Galvanized Shot are going to make it even quicker for these stacks to max out, because at that point you only need to just have a hard hitting weapon to bring enemy health down to the 20% mark, so you might as well just chuck in a couple of viral procs as well to make things even easier. And then of course, once the enemy displays the Parazon mark, you just basically Parazon them, and that's pretty much it. On a side note, I would like to request that DE also adds Gokstat officers to the list of enemies that can be Parazon, because they're essentially just even tankier versions of heavy gunners. We're looking at enemies that basically look like heavy gunners, let's be real here, and at the same time they have more armor and they have more health. Stands the reason that they should be part of the Parazonable list to keep their consistency. On a side note, it seems like the Epitaph's charge shots have guaranteed impact procs, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, so it's entirely possible that the Epitaph could also be a hilariously powerful anti-tank gun. Number 2. For number 2, we have two weapons that I'm very excited to have a look at when the update drops, and that's going to be the Cernos and the Artemis Bow Primes. Both of these bows are spray bows, so it'll be absolutely fascinating to see how much insanity we can get up to using specifically Galvanized Chamber. Now, hopefully Galvanized Chamber can be used on the Artemis Bow Prime. We have a lot of mods that we would like to use on something like the Artemis Bow Prime that are currently not available to be used on the Artemis Bow Prime, for example split flights. So hopefully Galvanized Chamber as well as all of the other galvanized mods will be available for the exalted weapons. I don't think DE has indicated one way or the other as of right now whether or not the galvanized mods will be available for the exalted weapons, so fingers crossed they are actually going to be available for them. If not, that's going to be extremely disappointing and perhaps particularly rage inducing. We'll just have to see. But doing the quick math here, if I were to use Galvanized Chamber on, say, the Artemis Bow Prime that currently has a base multi-shot of 7 arrows, maxing out the Galvanized Chamber will actually result in 23.1 arrows per volley. That is a lot of arrows, so I'm very excited to be able to try and use that, especially in something like an Eidolon hunt, especially if the on-kill mechanic of the Galvanized Chamber also works in taking out 1 or 2 Vomulists, or at least putting them into their sort of ethereal, sort of kill them with the operator state. If that counts, oh boy, I'm going to be very excited in using something like the Artemis Bow Prime, 1000%. Meanwhile, the base multi-shot of Cernos Prime is sitting at 3, so with a max Galvanized Chamber, we should be resulting in somewhere along the lines of 12.9 arrows per volley. Now, I happen to have a multi-shot Riven as well, so I should be shooting somewhere along the 16.5 arrows per volley, so it's going to be very exciting to see what kind of nonsense we can get up to. Again, I'll be keen to test out my Artemis Bow Prime against Eidolons in particular, preferably on the Steel Path variety, but let's just start off with the normal variety to see how ridiculous it already is. Seems like a lot of people are not really doing Steel Path Eidolons, it's probably just me and maybe one other person, so not really the best way to test the power of the Artemis Bow Prime against Eidolons. We'll stick to the normal one. Number 1. For number 1, and this has to be absolutely bleeding obvious, but of course I'm going to be looking at the Paris Prime. But I also want to keep all sniper rifles in this category as well, because they're going to probably have the same kind of power differential moving forward. Now, naturally, when I keep an eye on my beloved Paris Prime, I've already done the math and we've already discussed this on stream, but in theory I will be definitely looking into using Galvanized Scope, and galvanized chamber with the possible addition of galvanized aptitude. Now, if my math is correct, if I use galvanized scope and have my full maximum stacks of galvanized scope as well as the point strike on my Parvos Prime, I should be getting around 256.5% crit chance. What this basically means is we're going to be seeing guaranteed oranges really quickly. Now, I happen to have a Riven as well, and if I've done the math properly with my Riven, my Parvos Prime will be reaching somewhere around the 337.95% crit chance. So that's guaranteed reds, and I'm very excited for that. Naturally, of course, you may be thinking, oh, that's not going to kill anything, but, you know, when you pair that with someone like Bag, when you pair that with someone like Hildren, Ember, anyway, who can strip armor as well, Parvos Prime pretty much can decimate a whole lot of enemies, so I'm very excited for that as well. That being said though, when it comes to using galvanized aptitude in my Parvos Prime build, it might not be that effective, but at the same time it could potentially be a nice addition alongside Visage Bal, and at that point the Parvos Prime could become an even more healing based bow because of Visage Bal, so we'll have to see if I really want to get into that particular idea as well. So that's pretty much it. Let me know what weapons you're keen to keep an eye on when the update drops, whether it be primary weapons, secondary weapons, hell, let me know what melee weapons you'd like to keep an eye on and whether or not they're still effective after the melee nerfs, however severe or maybe not that severe they actually are. I will of course be keeping an eye on all my favorite melee weapons, in particular the Sigma Anoctanus, Glaives, maybe even a great sword or two, we'll just have to see. But that's pretty much it. Hope you guys enjoy this. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more WarFrame content, and until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye!